it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Symbiosis by Alice B. Sullivan. Part 1. The alarm wailed. Flashing white lights accompanied the near-deafening sound. Dr. Philip Shirley shuffled through the papers sprawled on the tabletop. He scanned the data, piece by piece, over and over again, searching for the answer to his mistake. None of his research implied things would go so wrong. He was supposed to reimagine modern medicine. Instead of changing the world, he'd ruined everything. Phil? Philip's wife, Brenda, placed her hand on his shoulder. It's time to go. Her words were calm and close to Philip's ear. Philip froze, clutching a sheet of paper to where the words formed an unreadable mass, frustration leaking from him by the sight of his trembling hands. He wasn't angry with his wife. He was angry with himself. But he couldn't leave, not yet. Leaving meant quitting, and quitting meant finality. Philip staked his entire career on nothing ever being final. Mistakes were never anything but hiccups, errors that slipped past eyes after eyes. He was a reputable parasitologist. He'd gone through so much to reach this point in his life. This was surely an error he could locate and fix. He just needed time. But time had never been a friend. And when Brenda spoke up, her nerves seemingly unperturbed by the chaos ensuing around them, Philip felt the weight he'd been so desperately avoiding start to crush him. Everything became real. His mistakes couldn't be fixed. Why didn't he predict the mutation? How could he be so stupid? It was elementary, it was careless, and it would cost many people their lives. Brenda squeezed Philip's shoulder. Let's go, she said. Philip's body relaxed at her touch. It always did, and it always would. When the alarm sounded, Philip had checked his phone to see where it was triggered. The facility's security application read, Histology, room 240, second floor, opposite side of the building, though the reason for the trigger was unknown. The security application wasn't designed to relay why. Its only purpose was to tell you where. Philip figured it was tied to the riots and protests going on across the state ever since his experiment took a turn no one, especially him, had expected. A mix of peaceful and not-so-peaceful protesters crowded the front entrance of the facility every morning, cursing at Philip and his colleagues, even though his colleagues had nothing to do with it. It wasn't like rioters hadn't tried breaking in before. This was the fourth time within a month the alarm had gone off, the first 3 from attempts at unauthorized entry. After staring at the papers in front of him, all with figures, notes, data tables, and charts, Philip glanced at the picture sitting at the corner of his desk. It was him, his wife, and his daughter, Jackie. It was a simple image, the 3 of them standing outside the facility, smiling faces, Philip's arms around Brenda, his hand on Jackie's shoulder. But it was them, and it was real. They were a happy, loving family. And Philip did it all for his family. Jackie was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 7 years old. She got weaker and sicker, and all the chemotherapy did was empty their bank account. By the time she was 11, Jackie had relapsed twice. Philip had dedicated his work to finding an alternative treatment after the first relapse, when Jackie was 9. The second relapse only reconfirmed Philip's doubt in the worldwide accepted process. Over 6 years of research and Parasymbio was created. The biologically engineered protozoan parasites would target abnormal white blood cells and engulf them, while simultaneously strengthening the normal ones. It was FDA approved, and on to phase 4 where several hundred patients, including Jackie, would be injected with the parasites. Philip glanced between Brenda and Jackie in the photo. Jackie looked so much like her mother, from the slightly turned-up nose to the twinkle in her eyes, and when the chemotherapy hadn't taken her hair, it was the same shade of brown. She got her freckles and fair skin from Philip, though when Brenda was pregnant, he hoped the baby would share his soft red hair. Once Jackie was born, that no longer mattered. One look, and Philip was in love. He vowed to be the best father he could be. The picture was taken a week after Jackie's first injection. 16 years old, and she could finally have the childhood she deserved. Well, all of that work disappeared over the span of a mutation. It was all for nothing. Philip closed his eyes, trying to hold onto the image of his beloved daughter. It wasn't for nothing. It was all for her. She was healthy. She was happy. He stopped what would have killed her. Although Philip couldn't help but wonder. What if it had been her instead of Bobby? Bobby Welding, 10 years old, bedridden, diagnosed with fatal leukemia several months prior, was one of several hundred patients injected during Phase 4. Having reminded Philip of his daughter's struggle, he injected Bobby personally. Philip looked Bobby in the eyes and told him, promised him, everything will be okay now. It would never be okay again. By the second week, Bobby could walk, albeit with frequent breaks as his muscles regained their strength. Bobby was unrecognizable by week 4, the biggest, happiest grin, trying out for the soccer team, hardly ever becoming tired. It was an amazing sight. It wasn't until week 7 that everything fell apart. Bobby became catatonic. He was rushed to hospital where, upon examination, it was found that Bobby's parasites had mutated during their replication phase. 8 hours later, still hooked up to wires connected to machines monitoring his vitals, Bobby woke up. But it wasn't Bobby anymore. The mutated organisms fused with the original organisms to form what scientists refer to as autocrat parasites. Bobby's once friendly symbionts, the very things that made it so Bobby could, at last, enjoy his childhood, seized his central nervous system, turning him into nothing more than a shell of his former self, a means of spreading the parasites. That night, what used to be little Bobby Welding attacked his parents and a nurse before other nurses could restrain him. Parasymbio shut down. Corporations worked on ways to rid people's bodies of the very thing Philip spent years creating. What if it had been Jackie instead of Bobby? Philip shook the thought away, his mind desperately clinging to the image of his daughter, happy and healthy, rather than the what-if image of her attacking others, having to be sedated, to be locked up for everyone else's safety, like Bobby. When he was sure Jackie's image wouldn't fade, Philip nodded. Brenda was right. It was time to go. They should have evacuated the building already, but Philip refused to leave his research. He spent so much of his career researching and creating these organisms. Maybe there was no way he could fix his mistake, but he couldn't leave his work behind, even if it seemed like it had no place in the world anymore. Philip turned to face his wife and the first judge of his crimes. Her age shone with subtle creases at the corners of her eyes and shallow wrinkles at the middle of her forehead. Telling from the tank top under her jacket and the dirt marks on her khakis, her team must have been working in the field. Her hair probably started as a neat bun en route to her assignment. Loose strands now dangled in her face. It wouldn't be the work of a geologist if it wasn't a little messy. However, despite the dry sweat, the newly formed sunburn, and the dirt on her face, she was beautiful. Philip expected disappointment, even contempt. When he was met with soft, understanding eyes and a gentle smile, he remembered what his guilt tried so hard to cloud. Brenda would never offer the cruel judgment he thought he deserved. She knew he didn't do it on purpose. His research suggested a symbiotic relationship where the host would house the parasites, and in return, the parasites would do what they were engineered to do, suppress the cancer. Dr. Philip Shirley only ever wanted to help people. He only ever wanted to heal his daughter. Brenda knew that. How could he ever think she'd judge him? "You're my rock, Brenda," Philip said. Brenda smiled. contrast to Philip's frown. "And you're mine," she replied. She took his free hand and led them out of the lab, down the hall, Philip still holding a mess of papers to his chest. Philip's lab was on the 3rd floor. Following proper protocol during an evacuation, elevators were off limits, leaving stairwells as the only routes to the ground floor. Once outside, Philip would face protesters who mercilessly blamed him for the chaos erupting throughout the state of California. They'd throw garbage, curse his name, and chant for his resignation, even his death. When Philip first started this experiment, he never imagined it would end like this. Part 2. The halls were empty. The last person Philip saw was a female intern leaving a neighboring lab, heading toward the stairwell not long after the alarm first sounded. Philip hadn't seen anyone since. "When we get outside, Phil," Brenda began, "whatever's out there, remember not to feed the trolls." The lulls in the alarm allowed minimal conversation, the brief silence peaceful, until the alarm wailed again. Philip looked at Brenda, catching a glimpse of her sly glance following the joke. He smiled. The joke reminded him of Jackie, the sole motivation for this project. It was the advice he expected her to take when dealing with bullies, people who didn't want to understand her condition. Then again, it's always easier to tell others how to handle things. Philip wondered if he could ever apply his advice to his life. He wasn't dealing with children bullying him because they didn't like his shoes or thought he was a nerd for wearing glasses. No, he was dealing with adults, some of whom were other reputable scientists, judging him for not a simple error in his research, but for an unpredictable phenomenon. Philip's mistake cost a little boy his consciousness and his parents' trust in medical discovery. It was Philip's fault the state of California was in an uproar. Hundreds of residents were infected with the things that turned Bobby Welding into a maniac, and people were terrified it would happen again. Philip and Brenda turned right when they hit a T-junction. As they continued down the hall, Philip spotted a piece of paper on the floor. One became two, which became a stream, until they traveled over a pile. He peered down the corridor, raising an eyebrow at the line of wide-open doors. Even the alarm, having masked every sound, left a cold, paralyzing stillness that prickled Philip's nerves. He turned to his wife, ready to discuss this peculiar observation. Brenda wasn't beside him. Twisting around, Philip was met with Brenda's pale, horrified expression. Confused fear struck him. His eyes followed her fixed gaze. He dropped his research to the floor. Good God. Blood trailed across the long rectangular windows framing the entrance to the 3rd floor botany lab. Beyond those windows, a ravaged workspace of turned-over tables and tossed chairs, broken glass and fallen file cabinets. Paper littered everywhere. And blood. There was so much blood. Brenda wrapped her arm under Philip's. She might have said something. She could have said anything. All Philip could hear was the alarm. All he could see was the destruction in front of him. All he could feel was the panic creeping into his chest, beating his heart against his ribs. Philip looked down the hall the way they'd come, then directed his gaze the way they were going. Nothing indicated anyone was still around, but they couldn't just stand there gawking. They needed to move. Philip began to walk, unintentionally pulling his wife along with him. He reached into his lab coat pocket to retrieve his cell phone. With each passing moment, the real cause for the alarm became apparent, and Philip could hardly stomach it. "Where are we going?" Brenda shouted. Philip strode down the hall, fiddling with his phone, inwardly trying to discredit his horrible assumption. The blood-stained walls didn't help. "Same as before," he shouted back, "only faster." The phone wouldn't turn on. He stuffed it back into his pocket, waiting for a drop in the alarm to say, "Let me see your phone." Brenda pulled her phone out and handed it to Philip. "What's going on?" Philip said nothing. Admitting he had no idea what was happening would make his powerlessness feel too real. He had to focus on getting help and getting out. He dialed 911 and brought the phone to his ear. A high-pitched beep answered. Our dispatchers are busy handling other emergency calls at this time. Please do not hang up. Philip hung up and redialed. The automated message replayed. Philip hung up again, cursing under his breath, discarding the phone in his coat pocket. The alarm should have notified the authorities immediately. This should have been handled, and yet the alarm was still screaming, and it seemed as if Philip and Brenda were the only people around. Philip guided Brenda past lab after lab. The carnage followed, and Philip's assumption rang truer. Folders and loose papers strewn the floor. Handprints stamped the walls in blood. Trails of red led through doorways to the rooms beyond. They stared in horror, but neither investigated. The implication was enough for the both of them. As they approached the third-floor pathology lab, the last room before the stairwell, Philip stopped at a puddle of something in the middle of the hall. It was a mixture of brown and red, and it smelled awful. Brenda stepped out from behind Philip, slapping a hand over her nose and mouth. At a drop in the alarm, like a carrying whisper, Philip heard a groan. He shot a look at the pathology lab's door. It was ajar. Did you hear that? Philip turned his ear to the door. I think someone's in there. He reached for the doorknob, only for Brenda to yank him back. Brenda shook her head, her eyes wide, her face pale. Philip gave her a wounded look, stealing glimpses at the pathology lab. There's someone in there, he said, barely audible over the alarm. Regardless of if Brenda actually heard him, or if it was just a coincidence, she shouted, The alarm's playing tricks on you. She tugged his arm then. We need to leave. If Philip was right, and it appeared he was, then a biohazard was loose within the facility. He couldn't walk away knowing someone needed help. We can't leave them. He pulled himself free and went for the door, sliding it through the opening, disappearing into the room. The flashing white lights slashed through the darkness, the guttural cry of the alarm begging something to sneak up behind you. Philip fumbled for the light switch. The ceiling bulbs flickered on, illuminating a seemingly empty lab. Other than a computer chair pushed too far from its desk and a few pieces of paper on the floor, the room was tidy, or as tidy as a research lab can be. There were slides and cultures at stations. Even a pair of glasses had been left sitting next to one of the microscopes. Hello? Philip called out. Is anyone there? A headache formed behind his eyes. It was faint, but it was there. He was growing tired of having to compete with the alarm. The authorities should have arrived a long time ago. The alarm had been on for well over an hour. If the authorities arrived, they would have shut the alarm off. Why hadn't they come? Philip hated pondering what-if scenarios, though science birthed discoveries based on such things. His mind wasn't buzzing with ideas. It buzzed with fear and worry, and those what-ifs weren't making discoveries. They created nightmarish scenarios involving every horror movie trope Philip had ever seen. With every bit of strength, he pushed the obscene thoughts away, walking deeper into the lab, past abandoned research and data, past equipment left in the middle of use. Nothing indicated anyone was still around. Maybe Brenda was right. Maybe the alarm was playing tricks on him. Nobody was there, and Philip was wasting time. As Philip turned, ready to leave, there was another groan. It was louder, clearer, closer. Philip whipped back around, continuing his search, his eyes scanning the lab. He halted at the sight of a foot sticking out from behind a desk. The foot flinched. Hello? Philip called out. The foot retracted, and the person rose. The man stood with a slight hunch in his back, his eyes glazed, his jaw slacked. His short grey hair was wild and his skin was pale. Dr. Stanley Pierce, senior pathologist. He and Philip had worked together for years. The tear in Stanley's coat sleeve caught Philip's eye. The material was drenched in red. "Stanley?" Philip's eyes darted between the wound and Stanley's face. "Stanley, are you okay?" Stanley wobbled before finding some sort of balance. He said nothing, staring at Philip with a dazed expression as he stumbled drunkenly around the desk. A chill straightened Philip's spine, a chill that demanded he turn and run. His racing heart and trembling knees agreed. "Stanley." Philip's voice quivered. "Please, talk to me." Stanley stopped at the front of the table. When he went to speak, he doubled over, wrapping his arms around himself. Vomit poured from his mouth. He retched and retched, the viscous liquid splattering on the linoleum. Philip stepped back. As he watched his colleague vomit, an awful thought bled into his mind, threatening to rise the more he forced it away. There was a biohazard loose in the facility. There was no doubt about it. But its origin? Philip shook the absurd thought away. It was impossible. Stanley adjusted himself, his movements slow and crooked, until his gaze settled on Philip. His eyes were no longer glazed, but fixed now with an intense focus. The air in the room thickened. Philip's heart beat faster, his knees threatening to give way at any moment. His intuition burned with a single command. Run. Philip put up his hands in surrender as he slowly backed away. Stanley matched those steps, going forward, rolling his shoulders, cocking his head from side to side. "Stanley," Philip said, "whatever's going on, you don't—" Philip smacked into the corner of a table. He hissed, grasping at his hip. Stanley kept coming, unfazed by Philip's words, more interested in his movements. He cornered Philip against the table, towering over him. Philip trembled in fear as his colleague's bloodshot eyes picked him apart. He could smell the vomit on Stanley's breath, the acidic aroma churning his gut. Stanley licked his lips, then opened his mouth. His tongue glided across his upper teeth, saliva dribbling down his chin. As Philip fought the urge to yell, that awful thought sank deeper, rooting itself, until it was the only possible answer. It didn't make any sense, and Philip prayed he was wrong. "Hey!" Brenda's voice was half horror, half confused, but it cut through the alarm loud enough that Stanley shot her a look. He growled a gargled noise that made Philip's skin crawl. Taking the opportunity with haste, Philip drove his knee between Stanley's thighs. The pathologist howled, and when he stumbled back, Philip maneuvered around the table and fled. He grabbed his wife's hand, yanking her along. Brenda slammed the door behind them. The pair hurried to the stairwell. Brenda shouted for Philip to tell her what had happened, but Philip didn't answer. What he inferred wasn't sensical, was it? No, it couldn't be, but yet... Dr. Stanley Pierce's symptoms were comparable to Bobby's symptoms. Strange behavior, unresponsive, hyperfixation, burst blood vessels in the sclera, vomiting. There was no denying it. It was unmistakable, and it hardened Philip's stomach like a rock. He didn't know how, but what happened to Bobby was now happening to his colleagues. Part 3. The light in the stairwell flickered off-beat, with the already flashing lights, and the piercing sound of the alarm sharper in the confined space. Philip gripped Brenda's hand, pulling her as he rushed down the many flights of stairs to what he hoped was safety. He hadn't stopped moving since his sickening confrontation with Dr. Stanley Pierce, or at least what used to be Dr. Stanley Pierce. Calling whatever that thing was Stanley seemed wrong. It'd never be Stanley again. Somehow the bioengineered parasites had weaseled their way into Stanley's central nervous system, leaving behind nothing but a puppet to do their bidding, like Bobby Welding. With everything Philip had seen, a horrific question came to light. How many more of his colleagues were infected? Brenda yanked Philip back. "Philip, answer me." Philip stumbled, then stared at Brenda, dumbfounded. She furrowed her brow, saying, "What was that?" Her words reverberated off the walls in time with a lull in the alarm. Philip swallowed hard, glancing up and down the stairwell, anxiousness creeping into his nerves. "Brenda, we have to keep moving." Brenda's brooding eyes pleaded to Philip. She slowly shook her head. Clenching a fist, Philip worried his bottom lip between his teeth, stepping closer to his wife. He was foolish to think he could keep her from it for long. He thought they'd escape first. At least then they'd have time. He squeezed her hand, shame keeping his eyes from meeting hers. "My experiment," he said as the alarm dropped, and then wailed not a second later. "I don't know how, but Stanley, the parasites, they're inside him." Brenda said nothing, forcing Philip to look at her. Her mouth was a thin line, her gaze miles away. "How do you know?" Shaking his head, Philip said, "We don't have time for this. We can't. We need to go." Brenda blinked, her expression hard as stone. "We need to call Jackie." Philip straightened. He scrutinized the soft creases of Brenda's face. She didn't seem scared anymore. She didn't seem angry. Philip couldn't tell how she felt, but it neared a frightening apathy, as if she accepted a fate not yet sealed. Philip pulled out Brenda's cell phone and stared at it. Jackie was with her friends at the mall. He knew she'd pick up, but was it fair? She wouldn't be able to help them. Telling her would only worry her. It wouldn't be fair. Brenda cupped Philip's hand in hers. They made eye contact, Philip's eyes trembling with uncertainty, Brenda's still with intent. She took the phone and dialed a number, then brought the device to her ear. Philip counted to 10 before she spoke. "Jackie?" She stuck a finger in her free ear. No, everything's okay, it's just..." Her gaze met Philip's. The lie she would tell burned his tongue. "It was a rioter," she said. Yeah, your father's okay. Now, Jackie, listen, we might be late coming home tonight." Brenda struggled to smile. "Of course, yeah, you can stay at Mel's, yeah. We love you too, Jackie." She paused, a tear glistened in her eye. "We love you so much." The moment lingered before she hung up, and she handed the phone to Philip. Philip's chest ached. He yearned for his daughter. He knew Brenda wouldn't tell Jackie the truth. The truth wasn't what Jackie needed. Brenda nodded, a small smile appearing on her lips. Philip couldn't help but frown. He loved her. He fell in love with her more and more every day. How could she still love him? His mistakes were unforgivable, yet Brenda never blamed him. She stayed with him, stood by him. She was everything he could ever ask for and more, and her life was in danger because of him. He'd spent years saving his daughter. His wife spent years supporting him. Even when everything fell to pieces, Brenda saved him. His grip tightened on the phone. Brenda might have accepted a fate not yet sealed, but Philip refused to. Stuffing the phone back into his pocket, Philip took Brenda's hand and continued leading her down the stairs. Stepping onto the final platform, Philip threw himself around the railing, ready to charge the last set. He halted so suddenly, Brenda stumbled into him. Blood marked the shape of a handprint on the exit door. At the bottom of the staircase, a body sat slumped against the wall. The woman wasn't moving. Red coated her hands. Brown stained the chest of her white blouse. Her head lay limp, bloodied blonde hair like a veil over her face. Philip turned around, pushing Brenda back the way they came. Brenda refused Philip's advances, spying the door. "Philip!" Philip twisted around as the woman wobbled to her feet. He recognized her. The intern he saw when the alarm first sounded. Her arms hung without posture. Her spine stood crooked. Philip scrambled to push Brenda back, shouting, "Go!" The woman perked up, her hair peeling away from her face. Philip caught a glimpse of the former intern's clamped jaw and wide eyes before the staircase obscured his view. Remorse choked him. She was hired a month ago, unpaid. He didn't even know her name. When they rounded the second-floor platform, Philip snagged Brenda's arm, yanking her to a stop. They couldn't go back to the third floor. Whatever was left of Dr. Stanley Pierce was still there, and Philip had no intention of reuniting. He eyed the second-floor door. It was clean, displaced among the carnage they'd witnessed thus far. The sound of the intern struggling to climb the stairs echoed through the well. Philip reached for the door's handle, hesitation shaking his grip. He opened the door and peered down the hall. A clear path sent relief pouring through his veins. He gestured at Brenda to follow, and the two ventured into territory once friendly but now unknown. They passed walls smeared with red. They passed puddles of vomit. They passed empty labs left in ruin. Every step demanded Philip turn and run, to lock himself and his wife in a room and wait. Only he didn't know who or what they'd wait for. As they neared halfway down the hall, Philip picked up his pace, closing in on their destination. A woman in a white lab coat shuffled from a room into the hall, her movement stilted. Philip stopped, thrusting his arms behind himself to catch Brenda. Dr. Lin Wong, lead chemist in the facility's pharmaceutical department. She was turned the opposite way and hadn't noticed Philip or Brenda. Philip stared after his parasite-ridden colleague as she headed the way he and Brenda desperately needed to go. Before he could come up with a plan, he felt a tug on his coat sleeve. He turned, sucking in a breath at Brenda's gaped mouth, wide eyes and pointing finger. His heart stopped. Bodies, dozens of them, sat against the walls of a bisecting hall, their heads bowed, their limbs limp. None of them flinched. Blood and vomit trailed the floors. Philip didn't dare move until Brenda's nails dug into his arm. He redirected his gaze to Lynn, who was still none the wiser to their presence. An idea sparked. It was dangerous. It was stupid. It was the only thing he could do. Turning to his wife, he put a finger to his mouth, then flicked his head in Lynn's direction. Facing one was easier than facing dozens. They locked hands and tiptoed out of the T-junction toward the former chemist. Closing in on Lynn, Philip jerked himself from Brenda's grasp and sped up, gaining a distance from his wife, gaining momentum for what he needed to do. He launched himself at Lynn and they crashed to the floor. Pushing himself up, Philip groaned in pain. He spotted a horrified Brenda as the consequences of his actions struck him. He froze. Lynn twitched. Slapping his hand around Lynn's wrists, Philip shifted his weight to hold her down. "Go," he shouted to Brenda. Lynn struggled for freedom, writhing, flailing her legs. "Now!" Brenda winced, hesitating before she fled. Lynn shrieked, the height of the sound lost within the alarm. She thrashed and kicked and squirmed. Philip tightened his grip, forcing more of his weight, keeping Lynn as tamed as he could. He watched his wife flee, waiting, counting. Brenda was now over 50 feet away. It was now or never. In one fluid motion, Philip pushed himself off Lynn and darted after Brenda. He looked behind himself. Lynn attempted to stand, and the first of the staff from the bisecting hall lurched around the corner. Philip caught up to Brenda when she stopped at the stairwell's entrance. He yanked the door open, and Brenda ran through. Philip watched as more people flooded the corridor from the neighboring hall. Lynn was on her feet. Philip's stomach hardened. All these people. They didn't deserve this. They were innocent. "Philip!" Brenda cried, snapping him from his spell. "Come on!" After a final glance at the wobbling, stumbling stampede of bodies, Philip rushed through the doorway, ensuring the door closed behind him. His colleagues were gone. There was no time to mourn. Part 4. The crowd of former staff members met the stairwell door in a matter of seconds. They pounded their fists against the metal. They dragged their nails down the glass. The haunting sounds followed Philip and Brenda as they descended the stairs. 2 flights felt too long. Philip faced the spotless first-floor door. He had no time to wonder or hope or wish. It was another door they had to open, another floor they had to navigate. There was no telling what lay beyond. He opened it and peered down the hall. No one in sight. Ducking back, he gestured for Brenda to follow, and the two proceeded with caution. More labs, abandoned, bloodied, and destroyed. Research scattered. Philip eyed a puddle of fresh vomit, the pungent stench striking his nostrils, making him wince. More followed. Brown splattered on the wall, viscous liquid trailing like molasses to the floor. "Philip," Brenda said, loud enough to beat the alarm. "How could this have happened?" Philip's throat tightened. "I don't know," he said, eyes darting between blood spatters. "The only thing that makes sense is—" His voice lost itself within the cry of the alarm. The only thing that made sense was someone coming into contact with the autocrat parasites through a different host. If that were true, and Philip prayed it wasn't, then what happened to Bobby, what happened to Stanley, to the intern, to Lynn? It could happen to the rest of the state, the whole country. Millions would lose more than just their lives. They'd lose their humanity. Philip's creation should have changed the world, but not like this. The main lobby was just past the floor's T-junction. Philip sped up, wishing he could move as fast as his heart pounded. They were going to make it. After everything that had happened, after everything they'd endured, Philip and Brenda would finally be safe. It wasn't long until his racing heart froze. Someone stepped into their path. Philip slowed and gestured for Brenda to stop. More bodies emerged, each one aimlessly walking, rolling their shoulders, craning their necks, twitching. All of them slack-jawed with glazed eyes. Blood and vomit stained their skin and clothes. Colleagues, secretaries, security guards, interns, all lost. "Oh, no," Philip and Brenda muttered in unison. "What do we do?" she asked. Philip looked beyond the crowd. The mob of monsters wearing familiar faces wobbled and scuffed their feet, bumping shoulders, unfazed. The crowd had to have been just shy of a dozen. There was no room to get through, no other way. They'd have to go back. Philip turned around, ready to retreat, when several bodies lurched out of the lab, cutting off their course. "Phil!" Brenda's voice hitched. Philip glanced between crowds, anxiety clawing at his chest, adrenaline pumping his heart with fear. He looked at his wife's terrified face. Didn't know what to do. His friends, his colleagues, now nothing more than hosts for his experiment. He and Brenda were trapped. They were trapped, and it was all his fault. What could they do? Brenda leaned in, body stiff, eyes fixed straight. "We need to do something," she said. Knots churned Philip's gut. Neither group had noticed him or Brenda yet. There was no more time to waste. Safety wasn't going back the way they came. Safety wasn't shoving Brenda in a room to force her to wait for help that might never come. Safety was 200 feet away, beyond a group of people riddled with organisms of Philip's design. He couldn't save his colleagues. Maybe he couldn't even save himself. But he could save his wife. He let Brenda's hand go. His chest tightened as he backed away, watching her terrified expression turn into horrified confusion. Sucking in a breath, he mouthed, "Run," before darting at the being standing between them and the exit. "Hey, over here," he shouted, waving his arms. "Philip," Brenda cried. The mix of staff halted with a jerk of their crooked bodies. Each one slowly turned their head, their glossy eyes putting Philip in the spotlight. "Come and get me," Philip taunted. "I'm fresh and ready to host my own experiment." Whether they understood the words or not, he didn't know, but he knew they understood sound. Sound meant something alive, which meant a viable host. If it's one thing a parasite wants, it's to survive. The hosts moved in unison toward him, their groans carrying on the alarm. Shooting a look at Brenda, he smiled apologetically, hoping she could forgive him. Part of him knew she never would. But it had to be done. He dashed down the bisecting hall before the look of betrayal on her face could change his mind. The bodies slumped against the walls didn't react until Philip passed them, their movements too slow to make him worry. His best chance was the side door at the end of the hall. He just had to get there. Elongating his strides, feeling the resistance against his lab coat, he glanced over his shoulder. His pursuers gave chase, their running more of a wobbly jog, their arms flailing at their sides. Their wide, unblinking eyes locked on him, jaws clenched. His plan had worked. He cleared the path. Brenda would be safe. It was only fair she escaped. Philip, well, he was right where he needed to be. Halfway down the hall, there were no more bodies sitting dormant on the floor. They were standing, running, chasing. Philip neared the side door. He was almost there, almost free. He'd race to reunite with Brenda. He'd hold her close. He'd kiss her. The protesters outside no longer scared him. Their thoughts, their words, their actions, they couldn't break him, not anymore. He'd face them with dignity and leave with his wife's hand in his. He and Brenda would be survivors. Whether they'd be the only survivors, he didn't know, but he refused to think about anyone else anymore. He picked up speed, spotting the greenery of the outside through the glass. Just a little further. He collided with the door. It didn't open. He pushed the latch again, feeling the metal sink into itself, hearing the lock unhinge. Again, the door didn't open. He cursed loudly. The answer stared him in the eyes, a paper promptly taped on the glass. Please use other exit. Philip slammed his fists against the sign, cursing a problem that should have been fixed days ago. If he'd had the time, he'd probably laugh at the inconvenience that seemed so minute any other day. A regular day promising regular things, like research and tests, not running for your life. The facility was gone, lost to whatever he'd created. A broken door latch would be the least of the authorities' worries when they cleared the building. But right now, a broken door latch was all that mattered. Philip shot a look behind himself. The hosts were already halfway down the hall, slowly gaining ground, their movements stilted and uncoordinated. The herd had grown. Others must have crawled out of their hiding spots after hearing their friends, joining the hunt with the hope of adding another. Philip had no intention of becoming part of their collection. He entered the stairwell to his right, skipping steps as he ascended. He could circle back to the first floor using the second. The parasites hadn't mastered motor function. The hosts were slow enough. He could make it. A few hosts caught the door before it closed, forcing their bodies against it, pushing it open, and the rest followed. Clambering sounds echoed through the well, swallowing every bit of Philip's confidence. And he pressed on, despite his growing uncertainty. The thought of holding his wife and seeing his daughter were the only things keeping the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Part 5. Philip lunged for the second-floor door, stopped only by the sight of something, shuffling on the other side. He stared in shock, his hand inches from the door's handle. The bodies came and went. A hand slapped the window, pulling a woman behind it. Her breath fogged the glass. She lazily rolled her neck, scrutinizing Philip with wide, bloodshot eyes. Her fist met the door. Again. The hollow sounds boomed through the well. Others swarmed her like cockroaches. Soon a mix of faces overtook the window, casting Philip in a daunting shadow. From the first floor, stumbling footsteps grew louder, nearer. There was no other choice. He had to go higher. The first of the mob was steps away from Philip as he lunged for the third-floor door. His fingers barely touched the handle before he was yanked back, nearly thrown down the stairs. The menacing gaze of a security guard seized him as he regained his balance. Philip straightened. He raised trembling hands in surrender, squinting to read the man's name tag pinned on his uniform. In a tremulous voice, he shouted, "Darryl, you don't have to do this." The guard's hands twitched as he drew quick breaths. From the look in his hemorrhaged eyes, Darryl was a man who no longer existed. "I know you're not feeling well," Philip continued. "I can help you." This lie turned his stomach. He had no idea if he could help him. He had no knowledge of these creatures other than the little he'd observed in the last hour. From the information gathered on Bobby Welding, vitals were higher than normal, awareness heightened, cognitive function decreased, aggression increased. Bobby was still alive, he just wasn't Bobby. As a scientist, Philip couldn't accept categorizing a group based on data recorded from one member. As someone fighting for his life, it was all he could do. His colleagues were alive. They had to be. If there was any consciousness left, it was turned off. It just needed to be re-triggered. Maybe that's what Philip had to do. If only the climbing footsteps weren't getting louder. Philip stepped forward, stealing glimpses of the door. "I know something's inside you, Darryl," he said. Darryl cocked his head, like he was listening, or maybe he was mindless and appreciated the noise coming from Philip's mouth. Either way, he seemed attentive. "I know it's telling you what to do, but you don't have to do it. You can resist." Philip took another step. "Do you have a wife, Darryl? A child?" Darryl's eyes narrowed, then widened. His snarl softened to a quivering lip. Philip picked up on the cues and pushed the boundary. "They wouldn't want this, Darryl," he said. "They'd want you to fight this so you can go home." They stared at each other. The alarm, the flashing lights, the echo of footsteps, all of it seemed to disappear as they locked gazes. Darryl's knees wobbled, stepping forward, a timid, fearful look seeping into his stone expression. Tears glistened in his eyes. Every ounce of air left Philip's lungs. It was working. Darryl reached out. The urge to reciprocate struck Philip, his heart leaping from his chest. Would it set Darryl off if he didn't? With a shaky hand, Philip returned the gesture, his fingers grazing Darryl's. Darryl's shoulders went limp as he stared longingly at the small embrace. He opened his mouth as if to speak, only to clamp his teeth shut and stumble backwards. His face twisted in pain. He groaned, grunted, winced, doubling over, shaking his head. "Darryl!" Philip cried. Darryl's scream set Philip's feet like concrete. The guard hit himself in the head over and over and over and over. Mouth agape, Philip watched in horror. "Darryl, stop!" Darryl jolted upright. The look of fear was gone, replaced by a hard, fixed stare. Philip extended his hand. "Darryl," he said in a gentle tone, "you have to fight it. You have to." Darryl's head twitched. His hands trembled. "Please, Darryl. What about your family? You have to try. You have to try for the—" Then Darryl leapt. Philip dodged, and the guard struck the railing. "Please," Philip shouted. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to listen to them." Darryl whipped around, his lip curling into a snarl. He pounced again. Philip dove out of the way, landing at the edge of the staircase. Darryl now faced him, panting, growling. Philip stood, using the railing as a crutch. "I'm begging you," he whimpered. "Please." Darryl charged. But Philip evaded the attack, and the guard tumbled down the stairs just as the infested mob rounded the platform. Philip bit his lip, listening to the groans. A twinge of sadness prickled his eyes as he hurried out of the stairwell. He didn't look back. Darryl was the first to fling himself at the door. His snarling face only hurt Philip more. The second and third of the crowd joined Darryl. 3 became 5, became too many to count. The image behind the window was squirming massive limbs. Philip rubbed his forehead and sniffed, fighting back tears. It almost worked. He had Daryl. He had him. And then he was gone again. Was it worth it? He scanned the indistinguishable body parts as they pressed against the glass. The door handle jiggled. He sucked in a breath. Surely those things weren't smart enough to... He shook his head. He couldn't risk finding out. He bolted down the hall, past the all-too-familiar bloodstains and destruction. The stairwell burst open moments later, the echo of metal smacking concrete shooting nails into Philip's spine. He looked over his shoulder. They were gaining on him, their movements more precise, smooth, quick. He turned back in time to collide with someone. Philip somersaulted several times before landing still, sprawled out on the cold linoleum floor. His ears rang and his vision spun. The former secretary stood, then twisted to bare teeth at her prey. Red veins snaked across manic eyes. Philip scrambled to his feet and ran. Pumping his arms faster, he begged his muscles not to quit. But those things were too close, and he was too tired. He couldn't go on. So he darted into a nearby room, slamming and locking the door just as the former secretary reached for him. The pounding fists came soon after. It was dark, save for the flashing lights. Philip flicked the light switch on to reveal an empty, cramped histology lab. An L-shaped island centered the room. Counters, cabinets, and shelves lined the side and back walls. Microscopes sat on the island in front of each chair. Binders, folders, boxes of latex gloves, and bottles of staining solution riddled everywhere in between. Brown slop freckled the floor. Out of breath and drenched in sweat, Philip stripped his lab coat and threw it over a chair. He had to think. He couldn't think. His thoughts felt like static. He spun a chair around and sat down, burying his face in his hands. Maybe those things would forget what they were doing. Maybe they'd think he was gone and wander off. Maybe if he just stayed quiet. Wherever rationalizing led him, it helped ease his racing mind. If only Brenda's mind could be eased. She had to be worried sick, terrified and distraught. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling. He and Brenda had been together for 20 years, and of those 20 years, they'd been married for 15. She was the first person he pitched this catastrophic idea to. She was the one who told him to go for it. He worked on Parasymbio for years, and Brenda only ever cheered him on. She was a wonderful woman with a wonderful heart. And she made it out. He had to believe she did, for his own sanity. As he listened to the panting and grunting lingering behind the door, he didn't know if he deserved the same mercy. Part 6. A ringtone filled the lulls in the alarm with a lively tune. Philip perked up. It took a moment for him to distinguish the song from the alarm, but when he did, he dashed from the chair, scrambling for his lab coat. He rummaged through the pocket, retrieving his wife's cell phone. He'd forgotten he had it. He raised the device and stared at the unrecognized number headlining the black call screen. A tired, desperate man stared back. A man who saved his daughter, a man who, in doing so, had created a plague, who destroyed his career and ruined so many lives. There wasn't a doubt in his mind he'd do it all again. He swiped the call button and brought the phone to his ear, plugging the other with a finger. Licking his lips, he swallowed hard, his throat like sandpaper, his tongue like chalk. "Hello?" he croaked. A stilted, familiar voice answered. "Phil, oh my God, you're alive!" Brenda sobbed, short breaths begging for oxygen. "Brenda!" Philip's heart twisted. She made it out. She made it out. He could say it with certainty. His plan had worked. Every muscle in his body relaxed at this realization. "Oh, I'm so relieved you're okay." "Phil?" She She sounded in pain. Her voice yearned for his name. "Dear, I'm here. The words struck him as soon as they left his lips. He should have been with her, holding her, comforting her. Instead, he was locked in a room with no exit other than a door leading to the things that chased him there in the first place. Brenda continued to cry, and his chest tightened. He needed to do something. He couldn't let her lose herself. "Brenda," he whispered. He could barely hear himself over the alarm, but he knew she could hear him. She quieted, yet her breath still came in gasps. "Do you remember the first time we took Jackie to the zoo?" She was silent before replying. "She begged to see the lions, but the exhibit was closed." Philip smiled. It was small, but it was genuine. "Yeah," he said. "Over 10 years later, and she still talks about it. Still can't believe she tried to sneak into the lion house when we weren't looking. What a card." He could still hear his daughter's voice, small, growing into something strong and mature, yet still holding a childlike wonder as she told and retold the story of how her father got her a private tour of the lion house. Brenda laughed. "Yeah, a wild card. If you hadn't gotten us in there, I don't think she would have let us live it down." She knows what she wants," Philip said, "and she tries and tries until she gets it." "Well, she's her father's daughter." There was distance now in Brenda's voice. So smart, so full of ideas. Philip frowned, his eyes shaking. "My ideas are why I'm here and not with you." Brenda was quiet. "Phil?" The tears came back. He could hear it in her voice. He knew what she was going to say. He dreaded this moment since he let go of her hand, and he couldn't avoid it any longer. There were always risks with the kind of work he did. He just never thought it would ever come to this. "How will they do it?" There was a silence, an awful heart-wrenching silence as if to punctuate Brenda's next words. "They're going to blow it up." He nodded slowly as if Brenda could see the motion. With wide eyes, he saw so many cherished memories flash in front of him. His and Brenda's first kiss, the moment he proposed, their wedding, when they brought Jackie home from the hospital. It all sped by in a second, ending on the day of Jackie's first injection, the day she could finally enjoy life to its fullest. It wasn't death that chilled him. It was the horror of leaving his family behind. "Phil?" "I'm here," he squeaked, biting his lip. "What do I do?" Her tone became frantic, choppy with sobs. "What do I tell Jackie?" Taking a deep, quivering breath, Philip found his nerves and said, "I regret none of it." He wiped his eyes. Tell her I'd do it all again if it meant she could live. The incessant pounding of his former colleagues had dwindled to occasional soft thuds. They were still out there, stalking the halls, waiting for him to be naive enough to leave. He glanced at the door, and a taunting thought manifested. Maybe if he had a little more time. The idea vanished as quickly as it came. He didn't have the right to beg for time. Asking was selfish. If he had it, could he even make it? He relished the fantasy. If he escaped, he could figure out how to destroy the parasites. He could bring those people back. Nobody understood what they were. They could still be alive. There could be a way to save them. He punched the floor. Grinding his teeth, he cursed at himself for giving in to an instinct he'd created. Curiosity for the unknown. His desire to learn, to know. He knew it was just a convoluted attempt to right his wrong. These people were trapped inside their minds because of him, and he couldn't tell if his inclination to cure them was purely out of selflessness. He had to accept what he promised he never would. He couldn't fix this. "Brenda, I'm sorry." His voice hitched. I love you so much. I didn't mean for this to happen. You have to believe me, please. Believe me, I didn't." The words poured from his mouth. He couldn't stop them, and he didn't want to. "Phil," Brenda whispered. He barely heard her over the alarm. He cupped his mouth, stifling sobs. "I never thought this was your fault," she continued, calm, sincere. "You made it so our daughter could live a happy life. All you ever wanted was to help people. None of this was your fault." Tears ran down Philip's cheeks. "You've always been my rock, Brenda. And you'll always be mine." He wiped his eyes and then cleared his throat. "Will you promise me one thing?" Brenda said nothing. She was probably fighting tears, trying to keep a level head, unwilling to break the way Philip wanted to, but couldn't. Neither of them could. "Make sure Jackie never stops talking about the time Daddy showed her the lions." After a long pause, she whispered, "I will. I love you. And I love you." Philip hung up. There was nothing else he could say. It was selfish to make Brenda continue, though all he wanted was to hear her voice as long as he could. He was already gone. He couldn't make her hold on. The phone's battery blinked 10%. Philip stared longingly at the screensaver, an image of Brenda and Jackie. Jackie draped over her mother's back, both of them making goofy faces at the camera. He caressed them. They were the loves of his life, and this was the last time he'd ever see them. He smiled as the first bomb made contact. The building trembled, jostling him. Dust and pieces of dry wall fell from the ceiling. He wasn't scared. Brenda had made it out, and he was at peace knowing that. He never took his eyes off the image of his family. The alarm cut off, leaving behind a deafening silence disturbed only by the impact of the second bomb. Part 7. Philip wasn't alive to witness a third explosion. Brenda would never truly know the moment her husband had died. She told herself he was gone when the first bomb hit, praying he didn't suffer, but she knew in her heart he was gone the moment he let go of her hand to lead the creatures away. Philip wouldn't want her to, but she blamed herself. She could still feel his fingers slipping through hers as he pulled away. His terrified eyes and soft, uncertain smile lingered at the front of her mind. She painfully, unwillingly wondered if he knew he'd never see his family again, but either answer was too much to bear. So instead she replayed their last conversation, desperately searching for the sound of his voice. The right sound, no fear, no sorrow. She wanted his laugh, the way his words sounded when he smiled. What he did for his family. Everything was always for his family. It was the reason she fell in love with him more and more every day. How would she tell Jackie? Her beloved daughter, the light of her life, enjoying her childhood with her friends. Her heart would break. What could Brenda do? Philip was gone. She had no choice but to move forward, to face the world as it was, broken. As the building burned, black smoke exploding into the sky, she closed her eyes, letting tears stream down her face. She clung to the sound of Philip's voice, even as it threatened to fade within the bombs, the chatter of people and sirens. She'd fight to hold on to his voice for the rest of her life. So, a bit of an interesting story behind today's video. Yeah, I was randomly surfing through another subreddit, completely different subject, and I came across someone who, well, having a really good chat about things, and it came out that she was an aspiring author, and so I took the opportunity to check out her work, and, well, luckily enough, she gave me permission to read this story to you all, and here we are. Wonderful, wonderful story. I really, really enjoyed that. There's links to her work in the video description. I'll probably pin a comment as well, so please go check it out. There's some books on Amazon, some free stuff to read as well, so that's all in the video description. Many, many thanks for that, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thoughts, feelings, anything you want to say in the comment section below the video, and as ever, I'll do my best to reply to as many as I can. Well, that was a pretty good Wednesday. A podcast will be coming out tomorrow night. A mix of some of the old stuff here from the channel, and probably some new stuff as well. And we're back here again on Friday. It just never ends, does it? Are you sure you're not fed up with me yet? Well, till then, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.